Welcome to Behind the Transaction with RGCF. This is part 2 of the video where we're discussing EQS. Still in the studio with me, Carl Swansbury, Head of Corporate Finance and Partner at RGCF. We've got Andy Goff, who's the CEO of EQS, and Rhiannon Nightingale, CF Director from RGCF. So we talked a little bit about the background to EQS, about where the transaction was coming from. Rhiannon, can you tell us a little bit about the funding options that are available to EQS and how they were discussed?
Yes, absolutely. So there are three main types of funding that we would usually consider when we're working with a business like EQS. Those funding options are, generally speaking, conventional debt, debt funds, and private equity partners. Undoubtedly, in order to determine which of those are the most appropriate routes to take, there is an awful lot to consider. First and foremost, however, is the funding need. Now, in this instance, that's not just the funding need to enable Andy and the team to undertake the MBO, nor the funding need to be able to achieve their first acquisition of Amano Technologies. But it was really important to consider upfront their ongoing strategy and whether any capital was needed to support that growth. Now, I know Andy's going to come on to that in a moment, so I won't go any further with that. However, once we understood the overall funding need, we then had to consider that with a multitude of other factors, such as different stakeholders' attitudes towards different types of funding and what that might mean for the business, the affordability of different types of funding and any cash drain on the business, and how that might impact their ability to grow. And finally, external market appetite towards transactions such as this. Having spent time with Andy and the team assessing the options, we then determined that the most appropriate routes in this instance were likely to be debt funds and private equity partners. Subsequently, Andy and the team, accompanied by ourselves, met with a number of debt funds and equity partners, as Carl indicated earlier, and ultimately we proceeded with London-based debt fund Shard Credit Partners due to their appetite, their ability to support EQS's ongoing growth strategy, and also the nature of their funding is debt-based.
Thanks, Rhiannon. So, Andy, Rhiannon just touched a little bit on, obviously, going forward an M&A strategy. So I understand, obviously, the ed tech sector is quite fragmented. So how is your strategy going to help change this and sort of, help with a bit of consolidation that benefits, end users in the end?
Absolutely, Jamie. And that was one of the key things for us that led us to the strategy and to talking to RGCF in the first place. We knew very much so that the disabled students allowance sector, within the EdTech sector was extremely fragmented. An example of that, when we were looking at non-medical health providers and think we needed to plug the gap there, and we found Amano, there's more than 200 smallish suppliers of non-medical health. So what we saw was that it was a great opportunity to look at the market and look at quality brands. And I think that's the key thing for us. We want to look at the quality brands where they're lifestyle businesses, where like us, they believe in what they do, but they haven't been able to scale. And what we felt was that we could take a smallish business that was based on quality and personalization for the learner, but then take that from being, in Amano's case, a Southwest-based business and take it national, which is what we've done with Innovate and Equality Learning over the years. So we always had this idea of a buy and build strategy, and it was fairly simple. That was going to be growth. I think one thing, though, Jimmy, that's worth pointing out is that without RGCF's expertise and help, and what they brought to the table was just a wealth of options that we would definitely not have been able to get without their support and guidance. And actually, it was that process that they took us through that enabled us to accelerate our strategy much beyond just what we thought we could do within the disabled students allowance sector. And in fact, what we're looking at now is not just being a consolidator within that and bringing this to more students. We're actually looking at consolidating the wider equality, diversity and inclusivity sector. So moving out of just DSA into business to education and business to business. And I think that's a key change in strategy, or an acceleration, certainly, of strategy that we wouldn't have been able to unlock ourselves.
Thanks, Andy. A nice endorsement there of the support that you've given. Carl, so taking that strategy of what Andy and the business want to achieve, the type of businesses they're after, how does RGCF, or how is RGCF supporting that buy and build strategy moving forward?
Sure. So as Andy suggested, Jamie, over the last 6 months, we've been working incredibly closely with Andy and the entire board at EQS to actually continually refine the company's growth strategy. And I'm sure Andy would agree, the strategy we had last December is somewhat different today. And that is a consequence of us actually identifying potential targets within certain sort of niches and verticals, but actually having approached them, maybe we've decided that that isn't the right way for EQS to grow and scale. So as a consequence of us challenging the management team and the board, as a consequence of our very detailed research and in turn the identification of many targets, I think we now have a much more refined acquisition strategy as a business. And as a consequence, Jamie, we now have 2 acquisitions that are now in exclusivity, and we're hopeful that those 2 acquisitions will complete in the next 2 to 3 months. And of course, we're continually looking for additional acquisition targets that will maybe be acquired into the group later this year.
That's fascinating. Obviously, we'll be looking at with interest of EQS's continuing journey and the progress of these acquisitions. So that's great. Rhiannon, Andy particularly, thank you very much for your time today, and look out for more behind the transaction videos from RGCF that will be coming soon.